Assalamualaikum, this is Snan and today we're going to talk about the pharyngeal apparatus. We're going to talk about the pharyngeal parts of pharyngeal apparatus including the pharyngeal arches, pharyngeal grooves, pharyngeal pouches. We're going to talk about the pharyngeal membrane and we are going to discuss all these concepts with the simple but informative diagram. So let's start. Pharyngeal apparatus. Now the pharyngeal apparatus is a combination of three parts. These are the paired structures and develop into various head and neck structures. So these three parts include the pharyngeal arches, the cleft grooves and the pouches. The arches are made up of mesoderm and form bones and muscles of the head and neck. The groove or cleft is ectoderm and form the structure of the air canal, while the pouch is the endoderm of the apparatus and forms a part of early tonsils, parathyroid, thyroid. Here we can see that this pink structure, which is the mesoderm, is known as the arch. The blue line is ectoderm and the ectoderm between two arches is groove or cleft, while inside the yellow structure is the endoderm. So the endoderm between two arches is the pouch. So the apparatus starts forming 6 little bars of mesoderm which develops from the primitive pharynx. Initially, there are 6, but the 5th arch regresses. Now, first of all, talking about the pharyngeal arch. Pharyngeal arch are the core of mesoderm with external and internal covering. Here we can see that this is a pharyngeal arch, this circle, which has a core of an external covering of ectoderm and internal covering of endoderm. So, pharyngeal arch is present bilaterally to the primitive pharynx, so it supports the lateral wall of the pharynx. The primitive arch, in the primitive arch, the migration of several cells occurs, that is neural crest cells, the myogenic cells, the angioblast. These causes the formation of nerves, these causes the formation of muscles, while the angioblast causes the formation of vessels. Now each arch has some structures in it, which includes the arteries. The arteries of pharyngeal arches arise from the truncus arteriosus and move around them and then empties in the dorsal aorta behind them. Here is the heart. Here is the truncus arteriosus, and arteries from there are moving towards the pharyngeal arches where they move around them and then empty into the dorsal aorta behind them. Secondly, there are cartilaginous rods. Third, the muscle component which are formed from the unsegmented portion of paraxial mesoderm and precordial plate. Lastly, the nerves which are derived from the neuroectoderm of the primordial brain. Since the nerves move toward the pharyngeal arches, so they supply the mucosa and muscles formed by them. Now, the fate of pharyngeal arches. First pharyngeal arch. The nerve associated with the first pharyngeal arch is the trigeminal nerve, and specifically stating the mandibular branch and the maxillary branch of the trigeminal nerve. When the cell migration occurs in the first arch during the 4th week, it divides into prominence, the mandibular prominence and the maxillary prominence. Here is the first pharyngeal arch, and during 4th week when cell migrate, it divides into upper maxillary prominence and the lower mandibular prominence. So, talking about bones. The bones from the maxillary prominence include the maxilla, the squamous part of temporal bone, and the zygomatic or cheekbone, while the bone from the mandibular prominence of the first arch include the mandible and from the part of mandible arise the malleus and incus. Now, as we know that bones are formed from the cartilage, so first pharyngeal arch has a cartilage whose different parts form different bones. Here we can see that the cartilage of first pharyngeal arch known as the Meckel cartilage. Now the proximal portion of this cartilage forms the malleus and incus, while the middle part of this cartilage forms the sphenomandibular ligament by regressing. Next, the muscles of the first pharyngeal arch. The muscles include, since the first pharyngeal arch is related with everything we need to chew, mastication, so the muscles include the chewing muscles, the swelling muscles, and the muscles to block the chewing noise. Chewing muscles include the temporalis, the pterygoid, and the masseter, while for swallowing we need mylohyoid formed from first arch, mylohyoid, tensor villi palantini, and the anterior belly of the digastric. In order to block the chewing noise, there is the formation of tensor tympani from the first pharyngeal arch. Now, moving toward the second pharyngeal arch. The second pharyngeal arch is involved in the formation of facial expressions. Nerve associated with it includes the facial nerve. Now, the bones. The second pharyngeal arch bones include the styloid process of the temporal bone. First one forms the squamous part of the temporal bone, while the second one forms the styloid process of temporal bone and the hyoid muscle, specifically speaking, the lesser horn of the hyoid muscle, and the stapes, which is one of the three short bones of the ear. Malleus and incus by first arch and the stapes by the second arch. The second arch forms a ligament between the styloid process of the temporal bone and the hyoid bone known as the stylohyoid ligament. Now, talking about the muscles of the second arch, as we know that anterior belly of digastric is formed by the first pharyngeal arch, so the posterior belly will be formed by the second pharyngeal arch. And since it has the styloid process temporal and hyoid bone, so the muscle connected to these two bones will be the stylohyoid formed by it. So both of these muscles help in swallowing. While we also know that it has the stapes bone, so the muscle which anchors the stapes known as stapedius is also formed by the second pharyngeal arch. Now moving towards the third pharyngeal arch. The third pharyngeal arch, nerve associated with it is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Now, talking about the bones, bones include the hyoid bone, specifically talking the greater horn of the hyoid bone. The lesser horn was formed by the second pharyngeal arch, while the greater horn of hyoid bone is formed by the third pharyngeal arch. Muscles associated with this arch is the stylopharyngeus, which helps in swelling. Now a question arises that the lesser horn is formed by second arch and the greater horn by third arch. Where does the body of the hyoid bone is formed? The body of hyoid bone is formed by the hypobranchial or hypopharyngeal eminence. This is the hypopharyngeal eminence from where the body of hyoid bone is formed. It is defined as a prominence in the embryonic floor between the third and the fourth pharyngeal arch. Now talking about the fourth and sixth pharyngeal arch. The fourth and sixth pharyngeal arch fuse to give rise to laryngeal cartilage with the exception of epiglottis. So the nerves of these include the vagus nerve, which goes to both fourth and sixth arches. The fifth one, we are not talking about that because it regresses with time. So the vagus nerve, specifically speaking, the superior laryngeal branch of vagus nerve give rise to fourth arch, while the recurrent laryngeal give rise to sixth arch. So muscles of these arches include, if we talk about the fourth one, these include the levator platini, which stops the food from entering the respiratory tract, and the constrictors of pharynx, which squeeze the food down the esophagus. Both of these are associated with the mouth and pharynx. While the third one produced by the fourth pharyngeal arch is the cricothyroid, which tenses the vocal cord. Now talking about the muscles formed by the sixth arch, these include the rest of the laryngeal muscles, that is the intrinsic muscles of the larynx. So this rest intrinsic muscles of the larynx and the cricothyroid formed by the fourth one both contribute to the larynx. Now a question arises that if epiglottis is not formed by the laryngeal cartilage formed by these, so where does it forms? It forms from the hypopharyngeal eminence we talked earlier. So now what about the tongue? Where does the tongue develops? The tongue takes three arches to form. The anterior 2/3 of the tongue is formed from the first pharyngeal arch, while the posterior 1/3 of the tongue is formed from the third and fourth arches. Now we have done the arches. Now talking about the pharyngeal groove or cleft. The pharyngeal groove or cleft are ectodermal depression that are present between two arches. So they separate the arches, 4 in number. Now talking about the first one, which helps form air. It forms the external auditory meatus, that is ear canal, and a part of the eardrum. While the second, third and fourth empty into a slit-like depression called the cervical sinus, and all of these fade as the embryo grow. Here you can see that this is the first pharyngeal groove, while the second, third and fourth open into a slit-like opening known as cervical sinus. This happens due to the elongation of second pharyngeal arch, which covers up the third and fourth pharyngeal arch. Now as you can see that all of these regresses with time, and then the mesoderm takes over, while the first one give rise to the external acoustic meatus. Now talking about the pharyngeal pouches. These are the outpocketings of endoderm between arches, 4 in number, and connected to the primitive pharynx. In the sagittal view, we can see that this is the endoderm of the primitive pharynx, this whole one, and the outpocketings are arising from its dorsal side. Actually, it is arising to laterally. These outpocketings are called the pharyngeal pouches. In the horizontal cut section, we can see that these pharyngeal pouches, which are present between two arches, are connected to the endoderm of the primitive pharynx. Now the first pharyngeal pouch expands into an elongated tubotympanic recess, which forms the internal acoustic meatus, that is the middle layer, and the eustachian tube, which is the part of which arises from the part of the recess in contact with the pharynx. Here is the first pouch, which goes into an elongated tube known as tubotympanic recess, and that's give rise to internal auditory meatus and the eustachian tube. The part of the recess which is in contact, this one here, which is in contact with the primitive pharynx, give rise to the eustachian tube. The second pouch gives rise to the primitive tonsil. Now talking about the third pouch. The third and fourth pouch have a specific phenomena, that is they divide into dorsal portion and ventral portion. Here we can see that this is the third and this is the fourth pouch. These divide into dorsal portion, which is going dorsally, and the ventral portion, which is going ventrally. Now the dorsal portion of the third pouch give rise to the inferior parathyroid, while the ventral portion of the third pouch give rise to the primitive thymus. Similarly, the dorsal portion of the fourth pouch give rise to the superior parathyroid gland, while the ventral portion give rise to the ultimopharyngeal body, which differentiate into parafollicular cells, and we know that parafollicular cells secrete calcitonin, which decreases the blood calcium level. Now, if we give an overview, the dorsal portion of the third pouch gives rise to inferior parathyroid gland, and the fourth pouch dorsal portion gives rise to superior parathyroid gland. Both of these collectively secrete the parathyroid hormone, which increases the blood sugar level. Now, talking about the pharyngeal membrane. The pharyngeal membrane is a combination of ectoderm of the groove and endoderm of the pouches. So here, as you know that the groove are depression from outside, while the pouch are depression elevation from the inside, endoderm. Both of these combine together to form the pharyngeal membrane, that is the ectodermal layer of the pharyngeal groove, while the endodermal layer of the pharyngeal pouch. Although they are total in 4 in number, only one pair of pharyngeal membrane contributes the formation of structure, and that is the first pharyngeal membrane pair, which becomes the tympanic membrane and helps in the formation of eardrum. Now, at the end of the lecture, talking about the fun facts, you have noticed that the third pharyngeal pouch gives rise to the inferior parathyroid gland. So, a question is, why the third pouch gives rise to inferior parathyroid although it is above fourth pouch? It should give rise to superior, but it is giving rise to inferior. The answer to this is the third pouch is accompanied by its ventral portion, which gives rise to the primitive thymus. Now, as we know that thymus has a position lower in the neck, so when the third pouch give rise to the parathyroid gland, it accompanies the thymus and gets a position lower than the fourth pouch. So the parathyroid gland produced by the fourth pouch gets a superior position, while due to the accompanying thymus, the parathyroid gland produced by the third pouch get an inferior position, giving rise to inferior parathyroid. And that's all for today. Please subscribe the channel, and thank you. Yep.